Cuba was the second major entrepot for early cocaine. And actually, for those of you who might know something about, old movies about Cuba or read something, you probably know that Cuba actually had, in contrast to Chile, actually did have a very storied reputation for drugs, particularly during the corrupt and hedonistic ambiance of pre-revolutionary Havana, which was a meeting ground of international gangsters under the Prior, Grau, and Batista regimes of the 1950s. What was striking to me in Cuba, as I was studying this problem, was the intense interest in cocaine by Cuban national mafiosos or merchants. There were a lot of say, American gangsters in Cuba during this period, but they were not involved, to my knowledge, in the cocaine trade at all. They were involved in other types of trades, but not cocaine. Cocaine was a kind of national project directed by men like Mendez Marfa, Martinez del Rey, the Fleifel family, and there you can tell by the name, also Turcos. And what they were doing was developing a connection to Bolivia and to the new sources of coca paste that were emerging in Bolivia during this period. Throughout the 1950s, you see labs popping up in Cuba for refining and transshipping Bolivian coca paste, or pasta básica de cocaína, in what is now actually a pretty familiar division of labor. That is, the peasants grow the coca paste, they make it in the jungle today, and it was a similar process back then. They have these pits where they take the coca and they stomp on it and they put, there's some elementary chemicals that are put into it, cement lime, kerosene, and out of that comes this pasta básica. And that was what was being made then in the 1950s as well, and then picked up by these Cuban couriers and brought to Havana and other places in Cuba where more sophisticated labs, they weren't really that sophisticated, they weren't like a pharmaceutical lab, but they were labs nonetheless, that refined it into the product that could be distributed for recreational usage, that is white powdered cocaine, cocaine hydrochloride. And with that, they were developing their own financing, their own retail circuits, and beginning, but Havana was the main area. Now that's what I was about to say. One of the most interesting things about this site, Havana was notorious in the 1950s for its sex and tourist industries. I guess just like Amsterdam today. Or maybe that's a little old in Amsterdam. We wouldn't even say that. That's so 20th century in Amsterdam. But Havana seemingly created the modern cultural taste of cocaine. And then it spread outward. You can sort of trace that because there were a lot of Latin American, Mexican mafiosos or Brazilian or Argentine. They would meet in Havana, or tourists would come from all over the hemisphere. They'd go to Havana. There was nothing particularly illegal about cocaine. Well, there probably was nominally illegal, but it was just one of these risque things that you did when you were in Havana. You'd take in a show, you'd hear some Cuban music, and you would try some coke. And it was just one of those legendary things about Havana in the 1950s. And so my thesis is that they actually created this new kind of cultural taste for cocaine, unlike the early 20th century recreational usage of cocaine, which had different connotations altogether. And this one is kind of the mambo cocaine circuit, because Cuban music, too, the same kind of thing, was a diaspora that was moving out of Cuba throughout Latin America, very popular during the 1950s and 1960s, from Havana into all of Latin America and also into the United States. So it was paralleled by this drug circuit of cocaine as well, I think. Anyway, in 1959, nonetheless, sort of this paradise gets lost, and that Castro's dramatic leftist revolution marked a historical turning point in cocaine's evolution as Fidel, who was no friend to capitalists and gangsters of any kind, expelled this new class of cocaine traders from Cuba, which actually made this group, there was a fairly substantial group of people, even more dependent on this very mobile drug trade, made them even more specialized in the marketing of cocaine across the Americas. So what effectively it did was it created a second Pan-American diaspora of cocaine traffickers, ranging from Argentina and Mexico and into Bolivia and all the way up into the heart of Miami, of all places, after 1961. Now, U.S. authorities at the time, and I think quite disingenuously, accused Castro of marketing cocaine, knowing that it was exactly the opposite, that it was the exiles who were, not all the exiles, but a group within the Cuban exiles who were the specialists in this now spreading and burgeoning cocaine trade. Thus, the 1959 revolution represented a new stage in the globalization and intensification of cocaine. Just to leave more time for discussion, I'm going to quickly go over some of the other intermediary sites. Chile and Cuba were the most important during the 1950s and 1960s. But this was also an era where seemed to be that cocaine was showing up in all parts of Latin America in one form or another. Especially in major cities, you would find small or large cocaine scenes emerging in a lot of places. For example, Brazil was one where cocaine was being marketed or trafficked or traded down the Amazon from either the Bolivian border region or from the Peruvian border region, and cocaine found a lot of usage in these kind of hedonistic use in Brazilian cities. And some of you may know actually that that's actually kind of important today. Brazil is actually the second largest cocaine consuming country in the world today. Although that's a particularly recent development, having much more to do with the crackdown on cocaine in Colombia. But the past 10 years, Brazil has emerged as the second largest consuming nation of cocaine after the United States. Argentina, which also has a great deal of cocaine today, also had a lot of early involvement with the drug because Argentina had a lot of mafias with Italian and Jewish groups in Argentina, and also this long border with Bolivia where coca paste was easily obtained. Mexico was a transit point very early on. Mexican mafias were involved with the complicity of Mexican officials as usual. In Colombia in the 1950s and 1960s, there was certainly a great deal of contraband, but it tended to be kind of contraband goods. There was a great deal of trade in, say, appliances and cigarettes across the Caribbean. By the late 1960s, there was beginning to be marijuana from the Santa Marta region, what would later be known as Colombian gold. But what is conspicuous for its absence during the 1950s and 1960s is cocaine. There is no evidence of any sort of systematic cocaine trading, and much less production, in Colombia during the 50s and 60s. It started elsewhere, in other words. Anyway, to sum this up, all of these channels of the 1950s and 60s was where new techniques, networks, alliances, risk-evading strategies were being tried out and perfected by this rising Pan-American class of career cocaine traffickers. They were in formation. You can watch them coming together during this period. In part, I'll get to this later, as they're being chased down by U.S. drug officials.